Let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Anita Allana, Senior Coordinator, Working Group for Women and moderator for today's session. Let us first set some norms for the session. All participants are requested to keep their mics on mute and close their videos. Please keep a note of your questions. We will take them during the question answer session. The topic for today's session is Women Confronting the Pandemic, Pain, Resilience, and Social Capital in Pakistan. Allow me to introduce our guest speaker. We are highly privileged to have with us Ms. Farida Shaheed, Executive Director of Shirkat Women's Resource Center and founding member of Women's Action Forum. For more than 25 years, Ms. Shaheed has worked to empower women and to further a gender-equal social justice agenda. Using classical and innovative research methodologies, she has published widely on the interface of women identity, state citizenship, and how this impacts rights. The winner of numerous awards, she has led efforts to take the voice of Pakistani women to international forums and bring home international commitments, especially around CEDAW, Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, SDG 5, Sustainable Development Goal 5, and the Beijing Platform for Action. She has served as the first United Nations independent expert, then special rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. Without much ado, I invite Ms. Farida to deliver her talk, Women Confronting the Pandemic, Pain, Resilience, and Social Capital in Pakistan.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. Thank you, Dr. Anita. And welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me and that you are able to see the screen. I will be speaking on this topic. So basically, this is a research. This is based on the research that was the gendered impact of COVID-19 in Pakistan. Sorry, I'm having. And this was carried out by Shirkat Women's Resource Center, that's my organization, and the Community Engagement Center of the Indus Hospital Network. And we had a large team, but the co-principal investigators was Asad and myself. We were trying to do a rapid assessment, but in fact, it took from June to December for the research. The research was carried out in 10 districts of Punjab, Sindh, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and involved 536 participants, of which 347 were women, 180 were men, because when we're talking about gendered impact, we wanted the male perspective as well. And we had 9 transgender persons. We had 9 persons living with disabilities also, but since this was an issue that we wanted to probe deeper, we then did separate 12 interviews of persons living with disabilities to get their perspective on what had happened during the pandemic, particularly this was during lockdown. So the aims of the research were to gain insights on the gender-specific impact of the pandemic and to gather reliable data and evidence-based recommendations so that governments, donors, CSOs, anyone working in the field could better plan for inclusive emergency planning and response and sustainable strategies. We then went on to produce 4 policy briefs for interventions on livelihood, gender-based violence, women living with disabilities, and social capital. So I think the big question for us, of course, was how do you conduct an effective but safe ethnographic data collection and research in COVID circumstances? And so we also did not want to carry out extractive research. So we went for participatory action research, and we took the SALT approach for this. And I have to thank Asad for pushing us into this new approach, which was amazing and which I want to spend a little time talking about because I think this is something that needs to be adopted. So SALT stands for stimulating, appreciating, listening and learning, and transfer. And this was developed in the early 2000s by people who were working in UN AIDS on HIV, who believed basically that it's essential for people to take ownership of their challenges. And when they do, they take actions to deal with it. There's a sense of ownership, and the action is then no longer dependent on external stimuli, and that is the basis for sustainability of any actions. So SALT catalyzes reflection. It facilitates people to recognize their humanity and strengths, and it thereby gives them confidence and motivation for actions, whether they're collective or they're individual. The key questions then are, what is humanity? I know that's a strange thing. People don't often think about it, but that was the key question. What does it mean for you? And then what have you done in the past, whatever your research environment is? So we were looking at COVID, so we said in the last few months, what have you done that made you proud? And then equally important was then asking people how they felt when they were remembering whatever action they spoke about, when they were relating this, and when they were hearing others speak as well. So, of course, we were not able, because of COVID circumstances, to do the entire cycle of actions that are included in SALT. So we did the first step of who we are, what makes us human, but the next steps would have been the shared dream, that is trying to get people to think about where do they want to be and through which process they want to arrive there. What is the current situation, self-assessment, therefore, what are you going to do about it, which is the action plan, then the action itself, and then a cycle, closing the cycle of what you learned, and how can we share this, and then starting again with the cycle. But I think what struck me is the key word for what does humanity mean was hamdardi. Hamdardi combines empathy and sympathy, and they also spoke of ehsas, having feelings, ehsas, feelings and consideration. In English, there's not an exact, I can't think of an exact translation, for others. And it was often about human beings, but it also often, people spoke about encompassing that ehsas for all living things, plants and animals as well. Other defining attributes of humanity was to consider and treat everyone equally, with kindness and love, without distinction of class, race, ethnicity, and religion. All of these were mentioned by different people. However, no one specified gender. So we should be clear that gender does not appear on people's radar. Treating others as you would have them treat you, living in peace and harmony, helping others in need. And some people then added things like, humanity is about not giving anyone else pain, forgiving those who have done you harm, and raising your voice for justice or raising it against injustice that you may be witnessing. So this was very encouraging for us, because we normally think that we are people who have forgotten about humanity. That was also mentioned. A lot of people did talk about how people today have lost their sense of humanity and don't refer to this and don't live by that. The actions that instilled pride, which is the second question, the vast majority was all about helping others, what you had done in order to help somebody else. And they were very closely related to what their expressions of humanity, what humanity meant to them. A handful, a minority, were also then proud of having either stood up for themselves or having done things despite the odds. So your own self-affirmation, for example, there was a woman radio jockey who continued to work despite knowing the dangers and the fear of COVID-19. However, in Pakistan, because we have this idea that we should not be telling others of the good deeds that we do, the sharing of these deeds was sometimes seen as problematic. कहते हैं ना कि एक हाथ या नेकी का कुएं में डाल, एक हाथ को दूसरे हाथ को नहीं पता होना चाहिए क्या कर रहा है. So the cultural imperatives of not knowing, letting others know your good deeds was something that was brought out, and it was also discussed by people. And I think a number of people said that normally we never speak about this, but this has given us an opportunity to talk and to reflect and actually to be proud that we can do something. The process, we called it Sikhna Sikhana. So it's not a one-way, we are extracting or we are teaching you. And secondly, there were no direct questions. So while we explored anxiety, household gender relations, livelihood issues, support sources, early age marriage, changes in marriages, the kind of questions we asked were not direct. So we did not ask whether whether domestic violence had increased, although that was common knowledge that it was increasing. We asked what was the changes that they experienced. It was done in a conversational message because we're in COVID. These were done, this was adapted to be used through WhatsApp and voice messages on telephones, a conversational introduction of what we hope to do, to get consent. The messages were then adapted to each local, sorry? The Urdu was then translated into Sindhi and Saraiki and Punjabi and Pashto so that it was more familiar to people and they would feel comfortable responding. And between each question, so it was a whole process. We told people this would be a process. We would be engaging them 6, 7 times to discuss what was going on. We gave them time to ask for clarifications if they needed, to reflect on what it was before they responded and were given the next question. The responses could either be private or public. And they were told this, they could be given in writing or verbal. So we received these messages. As I said, disabilities, there weren't enough people in the overall participants to be able to make an assessment. So we had different interviews for them. So what we did was in the field, we used a cascading research using chain referral techniques. So the Shirkat and the CEC teams, we were trained by Asad and her team for Shirkat was completely new. How to use the research tools. And as all participatory action research tools, you really need to practice them and go through it yourself in order to understand and implement these. Then our teams mentored a first tier of respondents. The first tier of respondents also functioned as community facilitators who took this project and these questions and these discussions into their own communities. So each person was asked to engage with 3 to 5 people that they knew around the same question. The questions, then they were circulated to tiers 2 and 3 because the CEC had 2 further tiers. However, in the end, it was largely tier 1 who was able to replicate with tier 3 rather than tier 2. These were considered to be tier 1 and tier 2 for the purpose of analysis. The responses to the questions were all documented. Some of the verbal ones were transcribed. Everything was put onto file, and we used Max QDA in order to do the analysis. So what I want to share is just some of the questions, some of the responses that we had from people in terms of how they felt. The last question we asked was, how did this research, how did you feel about participating? What did you get? So one is, it made me realize that serving humanity is very important. And in difficult times, we have to help others if we want them to help us. We have learning teaching program. I learned that together we can find a solution, that we're not alone. And the SALT approach is very much about giving people the affirmation that they have agency, they have capacity, they can make change happen if they want. There were changes in people, and very often they talked about how they had changed themselves. They started thinking about everything in depth. My thinking power was enhanced by answering those questions. That forced me to think and rethink. And the other thing I think is important here is that the groups, the little cohorts of groups, the WhatsApp groups for the research in each site, people were in contact with each other. They could see the public responses. They knew who was in the group. And it's important, I think, that they said, I did not feel strangers amongst the group members. It's like I knew them from before. And again, I think this has to do with the methodology. Thinking about other people and their sufferings, learning new things. I used to wait for the next question so I'd be able to gain some new knowledge. In fact, there was one participant whose phone broke and she was in a complete panic because she said afterwards that I was in a complete panic because I really did not want to miss out on the next process. They gained confidence and trust in themselves and being able to speak out. And I think this is where you have the key thing, that when someone wants to know what's inside our hearts, what we are, that we're doing, how we've gone through, what we've experienced. And they said, this is something the government should have done, asked us how we were, but they didn't. So we were thanked for asking and for starting this conversation and having empathy with them and with each other. So I think that is the value of having a SALT participatory action, but the SALT approach to me was new and very important. Now, to the research findings themselves, I'm not going to take a lot of time because I think these are things that people know. So the three things which came up was the loss or reduction of income, being cooped up, and the COVID itself, fear and stigma if anyone had it, but fear of catching COVID. Loss of income and being cooped up led to anxiety and tensions in the household. And this in turn then led to impact, but the impact on gendered impact was different. So for women, being cooped up and the loss of income led to being told they were useless because they were unable to manage the household with reduced resources. Their workload increased enormously, and there was no relief in their day because otherwise they said when the men went, when the children went, they found some relief. This was not possible. For the men, they were unable to fulfill societal roles of bread earners, but they were not doing anything and they had no outlet also. So they were very frustrated. And this is something that they then took out frustration. They were idle. They took out their frustration on women, on children, and fights with neighbors. And women then also then ended up taking out their frustrations. Chichirapan was very common. Everyone was chichira. And therefore, this tension in the household, actually domestic violence of all kinds increased. So you then had persons with disabilities. They were especially vulnerable, and I'll come to them. They had a whole series of issues that we don't really pay attention to. But the other thing that COVID did, being in lockdown, is that you were cut off from services. You were cut off from services for health. Reproductive health in particular was a big issue, but also in terms of finding relief from gender-based violence or any form of violence. So what the net result that we found is that women have very little social capital to access relief or to escape violence against women. So in terms of livelihood, so this was the main point that was given as impact. And women were disproportionately impacted because, as we know, they occupy the most vulnerable positions in the economic sector. They're informal workers, so home-based workers, domestic workers, daily wage earners, hawkers, people who would sell things house to house. All of them lost their livelihoods. In the formal sectors, the factory workers, the personal care sector, which is all your beauty parlors and etc. Your private employment also was impacted, especially schools and women. For women, the school area is a big occupation. And the female-headed or dependent households were especially vulnerable. This was in particular the case for single mothers, divorcees, widows, violence survivors, or those supporting survivors, or those supporting a person living with disabilities. Amongst the white collar and low salaried work, I think these people became invisible victims. Everyone spoke about the daily wage earners. Nobody spoke about the white collar. So they were living paycheck to paycheck, but found it hard to manage 3 meals a day, but they did not qualify for relief measures. So they were left without any support. Transgender women were sequestered in exploitative and insecure occupations already. They faced intense financial insecurity, stigma around transgenders increased, and their access to relief or alternative sources of income was really, really negligible. I have to say we had some attrition, so we had some sex workers, but none of them came through in the final questions and interactions. But the impact there was also impact on financially dependent women in terms of turmoil and pressure. There was constant demands on them. They were unable to manage the household, and this became a source of tension. So the coping strategies was obviously reduce household expenses, even at the risk of compromising food security. People used up their savings. They liquidated assets to increase cash flow, incurring debt. People who owned things like cattle or animals are easier to sell, were in a better position, but the long-term impact is once they had sold these assets, they have no means of reacquiring them. So this is important. A few acquired, just a very few women found new ways of leveraging their skills and internet access to find sustainable ways to generate income. And this was especially amongst younger women. Accessing relief was limited. They had limited access to support services. They could not register because they don't have the electronic internet connections or the tools. The digital gap in Pakistan is 38%. That is higher than all of the rest of South Asia, where the figures are very available, such as Bangladesh and India. Women were also being exploited in order to get relief. They were asked to do favors, they were asked to do household chores, or they were asked to commit to voting for somebody for small amounts. Only a handful approached government safety nets and relief schemes, indicating a huge gap in citizen-state relations. And then we have the domestic violence, which is really the dark underbelly of the pandemic. There were deep, deep anxieties about lost incomes, unsecure future, not knowing what would happen, as well as being cooped up together. Frayed tempers and irritability was common, was the norm. There's widespread depression and mental stress was talked about, household fights and squabbles, and these would spill out into fights largely amongst male neighborhood children and adults. But the fights were also amongst brothers. They were amongst sisters-in-law, anyone who was living in the same household. The impact, gender diverse. As I said, the men felt unable to fulfill what society has given them as their primary role and took out frustration. For women, they had huge demands on care, unpaid care and housework. The men and children, they said they were constantly asking them. Children were constantly fighting because they didn't know what to do. The women were in charge of trying to get them to study if studies were still continuing online. And some women who actually lost their livelihoods, strangely enough, also lost their status and support in home. So we had a few women who said they lost their jobs and then their in-laws refused to allow them to eat or to give food to their children. One case refused to even feed the children because she wasn't bringing in the income, and she ended up having to go to her sister to get them to eat. Some working women spoke up of welled up, impotent rage, furious, but not able to do anything about it. So they too became prone to fights and irritability. And children, I think, are the victims of the pandemic who are not spoken about. Women are spoken about in terms of domestic violence, but I think children suffered a lot, and we don't recognize that. So there was a differentiated impact. This is more, COVID was more of an urban than a rural phenomenon. The rural households did better, where they're dependent on their own resources. There was a gender differentiated attitudes. There was also urban migration to rural areas. So people who work in cities often went home if they had relatives in rural areas. That put additional burden, but they still managed better. The difference I found, which is most striking, is that all the women sympathized with the men being at home and frustrated and depressed. Hardly any of the men sympathized with the women's workload and what was happening to the women. However, where they did sympathize and recognize the huge burden of household work that women do, and where husbands started helping out, this did lead to better household dynamics and gender relations. So women's coping strategies in terms of domestic violence are virtually none. They asked natal family for help. They left their marriages or households. They ran to neighbors when desperate, but that was about it. In terms of girls and women living with disabilities, there's a whole host of things, and I don't have time to go into details, but the loss of attendance, those who need to be helped, they lost their attendance, became completely dependent on families, and the families have zero idea of how to cope and how to manage, how to respond to their needs. Then personal hygiene became a huge issue, especially for women and girls, because people living with disabilities usually take longer and they usually wait for everyone in the household to leave before they do their personal hygiene. Nobody was leaving the house. There were 11, 12, sometimes even 22 people using the same bathroom. And then there was screaming and yelling, causing a loss of self-confidence and self-respect, and of course, verbal as well as physical abuse and maltreatment by all family members. So this is not gender specific. Women were also those who were part of the abusers here. Suspended therapy led to people's physical abilities being reduced or increased pain, living with physical pain. The single person policy for people who are working in who are mobile through wheelchairs, they were unable to go to shops because there was just one person. The ramps were installed, were too steep for them to go. And then the relief and information we provided was simply not geared for persons living with disabilities, and very few actually received relief. So although the Ministry of Human Rights eventually put out a booklet in Braille, no one knew about this at all amongst those that we engaged with. And the precautionary measures that were being handed out on television, radio, etc., they ignored the specific conditions and the necessary practices of persons living with disabilities. So some people have to actually touch their environment if they are visually challenged to be able to negotiate their spaces. But everyone was being told, you don't go there, don't do this, you mustn't touch anything, etc., etc. Also those in wheelchair, they have to use their hands for the wheelchair. There was nothing to reassure them. They have, as always, less access to digital technology and devices. They had less CNICs than women. In fact, women generally have less CNICs, which was a need to qualify for government assistance. So few of the women who did apply for government schemes actually received aid. The packages of relief did not take into consideration the kinds of things that persons with disabilities require. Of course, this is specific to the nature of the disability, and that would require a database on persons living with disabilities. But of course, the government has zero database, and we are completely incapable of then responding to their needs. They had zero coping strategy. They just had to put up with it. I want to come to social capital. This is my last part. So social capital acts as safety networks and enhances resilience and recovery in disasters. And people speak of structural social capital, which consists of networks and access to people and resources, relational, which relates to mutual trust in social groupings, and cognitive, which is subjective understanding of shared understanding, right? There's another way of dividing social capital, which is bonding, which it means strong ties within a group, bridging, which brings linkages that help access outside resources outside that bonding group, but within the neighborhood and community. This diversifies resources, but does not move beyond community. And finally, there's the linking social capital, which are connections that communities can leverage to bring in non-local resources. I have to say, all the literature that we read on social capital related to earthquakes and floods, none of the literature was available regarding COVID or other pandemics and how social capital may have assisted. But this is the consistent opinion of all the literature, that this is crucial for resilience for community and individual. So this is important because it helps to fill gaps in official efforts and facilitates recovery. But in COVID disrupted the usual community cohesion. So the quarantine measures, the fear of catching the virus and fear of being asked for or to be seen to seek financial help undermined your routine social interactions, which underpins social capital. So this was, the pandemic was experienced as an individuated disaster, not a collective disaster, such as floods or earthquakes, etc., where communities facing a common disaster come together and help each other out. Yet, despite all the shortage of social capital, people did leverage social capital to ease the situation for themselves and others from both within and beyond the community. The community-based and other CSO efforts were applauded, and a handful of respondents had successfully accessed government schemes, especially Asad's program. People, I was extremely touched, I think all of the researchers were on the brink of disaster themselves. They received relief, they shared their relief with others, and they did some social accountability to make sure that people were included in government schemes. But there are differences in gender regarding social capital. So while men and women both mobilize different kinds of social capital for different issues, men enjoy a far greater quantum and far more diverse social capital in every category. So those two different types of categorizations I spoke about. Women, because they have restricted social engagements outside their homes, this constricts their social circles, which limits the social capital in times of need. Because women have far poorer financial bases, their social capital is less structural and more cognitive and relational in nature. Men simply have more friends than women. Working women have more friends than non-working women and wider circles and knowledge to draw upon. Health workers, this is very important. I think health workers were, for women, an important source of social capital that did not appear at all for men. So whether it was your LHW, your LHV, anyone in the health sector who interacts directly with communities were seen as people they could go to for help. Women tended to share their problems and turn to their husbands for help and advice far more than men shared and turned to their wives for advice. Female relatives and occasionally colleagues or students provided moral and emotional support, which is cognitive, relational, social capital, but women tended to rely on male relatives, usually brothers, for structural support. So to me, the conclusion is that you really need to build social capital of women, and their responses to how this SALT approach research interaction took place really underscored the paucity and the ardent desire they have for a platform, for a support group in which they can share their joys and sorrows, gain information, deepen understanding, and therefore feel confident to address their own issues. I'm not alone was commonly expressed in terms of what did you experience. The chance to express myself, ease the burden. So it felt really good to listen and be listened to. At least there was a platform where I can think about myself and share things. At least someone is asking what happened, what we experienced, our difficulties. People in the world who listen to the worries and problems of others. So I think these are, okay, so to end up, I'm just showing you here, you have the 4 policy briefs. And on the right and the left of your screens, this is a telephone app that Shirkat has developed for gender-based violence. It gives you laws, it gives you how to navigate this. I would really hope that as many of you can click on this icon down there to download it on your phones. I hope this is helpful. So thank you, everyone. That's it from me in terms of presentation.
So thank you so much, Farida, for a very informative and insightful talk. Your talk has surely given us much food for thought. Now move on to our discussion. Let me introduce the panelists for today. Dr. Rozina Karmaliani, Professor and Dean, School of Nursing and Midwifery. Ms. Sabina Khatri, Founder and Chairperson, Kiran Foundation. and Dr. Nargis Asad, Associate Professor and Interim Chair, Department of Psychiatry. We are really privileged to have all these panelists with us. I first invite Sabina to please share with us the impact of COVID on the community in which she works in Lyari, with a special focus on the role of women in COVID. So over to you, Sabina.
Thank you जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम. पहले तो फरीदा जी बेहतरीन, मैं इतनी इम्प्रेस्ड हूँ और इतना मजा आया मुझे. Not for a while did I blink my eye. It was such a wonderful presentation and so insightful. I think इस जगह पे बैठकर अभी जब मैं उठूंगी तो I am a different person. मुझे इतनी information आज मिली. So thank you for that. Dr. Anita, मेरे मामले में naturally I can only speak from my experience. जो मेरा काम है, जिन लोगों के साथ मैं वहीं से बात करूंगी उसी जगह से. मैं लियारी में काम करती हूँ और मेरा जो स्कूल सिस्टम है वो ट्रॉमा इन्फॉर्म्ड स्कूल सिस्टम है सिंस नाउ ऑलमोस्ट 16 years. तो सारा करिकुलम, सारी अप्रोचेस दे कम फ्रॉम द लेंस ऑफ मेंटल हेल्थ एंड वेल बीइंग सिंस मेनी years नाउ. तो वो ग्राउंड वर्क हमारा इतना हुआ था पहले से ही मदर्स के साथ. हमारा जो स्कूल सिस्टम है उसमें माँ की तालीम बच्चे की तालीम के साथ मैंडेटरी है. बच्चा अगर एडमिशन के लिए आता है तो माँ का एडमिशन उसके साथ लाजमी होता है. बच्चा 6 दिन आता है, माँ 4 दिन आती है. तो वो ग्राउंड वर्क इतने सालों का जो हुआ है उसमें मैंने ज्यादा उन लोगों से ये मालूमात की. कोविड के दौरान में पूछती रही. हमारा भी जो तरीका है जाहिर है क्योंकि व्हाट्सएप इज द मोस्ट कन्वीनियंट फॉर एवरीबडी. तो हमारे वॉइस मैसेजेस पे सारी हमारी मतलब गुफ्तगू हो रही होती है पेरेंट्स के साथ, रिसर्च कलेक्ट हो रही होती है, इनफॉर्मल रिसर्च है. हाउएवर वर्किंग विद ऑलमोस्ट मैं कहूँगी तकरीबन 1000 के करीब 900,000 मदर्स के साथ अब तक हम काम कर चुके हैं, जिसमें से तकरीबन 400 ऐसी मदर्स हैं कि जिनके साथ लॉन्गिट्यूडनल रिसर्च की जा सकती है क्योंकि वो हमारे साथ एसोसिएटेड हैं फॉर मेनी ईयर्स. तो जिनके साथ हम ज्यादा अरसा एसोसिएटेड हैं, कोई अराउंड 300 मदर्स के साथ मेरी 2-3 बार मुलाकातें हुई कि कोविड में क्या सिचुएशन है आपकी. तो उन्होंने जो मेजॉरिटी मेरे पास जो रिसर्च से जो फाइंडिंग्स आई वो ये कि बुरे वक्त में जो हस्बैंड वाइफ हैं उन्होंने एक दूसरे का बहुत साथ दिया. और वो हम मुझे यही बताती थी हमारी मदर्स कि हम देखते हैं कि हमारे अड़ोस पड़ोस में हमारे और रिश्तेदारों में सिचुएशंस बहुत खराब हो गई हैं, डोमेस्टिक वायलेंस बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ गया है, लेकिन हम जो हैं वो क्योंकि हमारी इतनी ग्राउंड वर्क हुई हुई थी, फ्रॉम इनसाइड आउट अप्रोच है हमारी. व्हेन वी एक्चुअली कोशिश करते हैं हम अपनी माओं को, अपने फादर्स को हम पहले उनकी अपनी जात के अंदर लेकर जाते हैं, उनकी पूरी जिंदगी को एनालाइज करते हैं ताकि वो उस जगह से आए जहां से उन्होंने पेन फील किया कभी भी अपने बचपन में. जब वो उसको प्रोसेस कर पाते हैं तो वो दूसरे इंसान को समझने की सलाहियत उनकी बढ़ जाती है. वो एम्पैथी की जगह से आते हैं रादर देन सिंपैथी. तो हस्बैंड वाइफ के बीच में जब एम्पैथी क्रिएट हो जाती है तो बुरे वक्त में दे काइंड ऑफ यूनाइट इवन मोर. तो मेरे केस में हमारे छोटे से ग्रुप ऑफ फैमिलीज में हमने एक बिल्कुल अलग सिचुएशन देखी निस्बतन जो भी मैंने अभी तक अटेंड की हैं सेमिनार्स और मैंने सुना है और जो रिसर्च जनरल निकली है उससे बहुत डिफरेंट थी. तो मैंने ये रियलाइज किया कि हमारी डे टू डे स्कूलिंग के अंदर, डे टू डे कॉन्वर्सेशंस के अंदर वो जो हमारे इंस्टीट्यूट्स हैं, हमारे कम्युनिटीज के अंदर जहाँ लोग डे टू डे जाते हैं, जैसे मस्जिद, मदरसे, स्कूल्स, शादी हॉल्स, जो ये जो सेंटर्स होते हैं जहाँ बच्चियां हमारी सीखती हैं सारे काम, टेक्निकल सेंटर्स, इन सब जगहों पे मेंटल हेल्थ की गुफ्तगू बहुत कॉमन और बहुत आम होनी चाहिए ताकि लोग अपने पेन को प्रोसेस करना सीखें. बहुत मुश्किल लगती है ये बात, लेकिन जब हमने ग्राउंड में जाके ये काम किया तो हमने देखा कि ऐसा लगता है कि हर शख्स ये बात समझता है, सबके अंदर ये बात ऑलरेडी है. जहनी सेहत और जहनी सेहत की जो फीलिंग्स तो हर कोई रखता है. तो ये जो 250-300 पेरेंट्स को जब हमने एनालाइज किया कि जिन्होंने हमारे साथ कुछ ज्यादा टाइम गुजारा है, उनकी फाइंडिंग्स बिल्कुल अलग थी उन पेरेंट्स से जिनको हमें ज्वाइन किए हुए बस साल हुआ. वहां जिन पेरेंट्स ने हमें ज्वाइन किए हुए कोई 6-8 महीने हुए हैं, उनके साथ भी हमने रिसर्च की कोविड में क्या सिचुएशन है. सैडली उस पेरेंट्स के ग्रुप में एक फादर ने सुसाइड कमिट की है. हमारे फादर्स में से जस्ट अ मंथ अगो और उसने सुसाइड करने से पहले एक वीडियो भी छोड़ी है। वो वीडियो जब हमने देखी कि किस तरह वो प्रेशराइज्ड है, और उस वीडियो में उसने ये कहा है कि मैं माँ और बीवी की ख्वाहिशात को पूरा नहीं कर पा रहा हूँ, माँ और बीवी के बीच में मैं दब गया हूँ। और उसने सुसाइड से पहले वो वीडियो बनाई है, और वो वीडियो उसने शेयर कर दी थी फेसबुक पे, और बहुत मुश्किल था वो। और उसके निस्बतन वो जिनके साथ बहुत ज्यादा काम हुआ ग्राउंड, उनका बिल्कुल फाइंडिंग्स अलग थी। तो मैं ये समझती हूँ कि जहनी सेहत की गुफ्तगू हमारे करिकुलम्स के अंदर स्कूल लेवल पे आनी चाहिए, और माँओं की तालीम स्कूल्स के अंदर मैंडेटरी होनी चाहिए बच्चों के साथ, स्पेशली उन एरियाज में जहाँ बोट मिस हुई है लोगों की।
So thank you so much, Ms. Sabina, for sharing your experiences. I now invite Dr. Rozina to highlight the impact of COVID on women, especially in relation to the triple burden that they bear.
Thank you so much, Anita, for giving me the opportunity. Farida, it was truly amazing piece of work, very well grounded in not only in theory, but in the context. And Pakistan, a lot of things came out from your study can help us develop interventions and encourage us to move towards a family concept and community concept, which we have been talking and working. So thank you for sharing that. Sabina, your experience of bringing positives from the couples who were already trained or the families who were already part of the system was a great learning, and maybe can be put in a way that others can learn from these stories and take up the implementation. So Anita, your question around triple burden, I think Farida explained very well. So I'm just going to briefly say that it's kind of a summary of what Farida has presented, the three things which we have heard of from Farida, and every one of us have experienced this as well. During the COVID time, because the entire family was home, so the household responsibilities on women tremendously increased. The caretaking responsibilities, because people were families within families, extended and immediate families were suffering from COVID. So in addition to the fear and anxiety, taking care of the people, women being the large caretaker, had more caretaking to do. And also then she had to become the teacher, not only a teacher as a mother, but actually helping with all the digital gadgets. And while if she was working woman, then she had to work her own office within the home household, where the expectation is that she is the one who will be doing the household chores. The perception and the lens, and shifting that lens for everyone within the household that she's home, but she's not home, was extremely difficult. Even for the younger children, that mom is home, but mom is not able to give the full attention. So working women were also suffering. Within the School of Nursing, if I see, many healthcare providers who were women had to leave their jobs, because when they were going home, the family was not accepting, because they were coming from an environment of a hospital where the COVID was there, and also because of the burden which they had to take care at home, looking at children's schooling, learning the new gadgets and all the digital equipments, taking care of the COVID patient or the elderly, and also more household people are home. The family is more home, as Farida mentioned, and therefore, excuse me, and therefore it was all coming to women. So as an outcome, what were the health effects? So we all know that uncertainties, fear, anxiety were all there. So studies coming from public health research background, as I was looking at, research is done in Pakistan, India, Turkey, China, UK. unanimously, all research studies gave us the idea that domestic violence, which was there, was increased, depression and anxiety increased, post-trauma or post-COVID stress syndrome was increased. So if men were, 30% of the men were subjected to stress and depression, 66% of women were. UNDP and UN reports have also shared globally that not only in Pakistan, but generally globally, violence has increased 30%. So already mental health, anxiety and depression, stress was already a heavy burden in our society. On top of that, COVID increased that. Violence in all spheres of life was already there, and violence further increased, not only on women, but on children. Healthcare providers were subjected to more hours, more work, and as well as when they were going home, they were suffering the isolation because they had to separate themselves from the children. Also pregnant healthcare workers or pregnant women in general, they had to worry more about their unborn children. So while they were taking care of the whole family, they were worrying about the elderly and the unborn children. And therefore, the social capital, which Farida was talking about, in terms of religious gatherings or in terms of access to parlors and in terms of neighbor chit-chat or communication with family and friends, these are very strong coping mechanisms for women, and these were absolutely missing. What can we do now and what we have learned from this triple burden? I think we have looked at some of the silver linings from this situation, which was globally affecting everyone, that generally everyone is now talking about not I, but we. Also developing countries, developed countries, whether we are talking about LMIC, or we are talking about other developed nations, everybody suffered. And therefore, the language shifted also from I to we. The exchange of knowledge was freely accessible and available to everyone. People were welcoming webinars and courses online for people to learn, for women and men to engage. Offices and mothers who wanted to be with their kids early on during the ECD part, they were able to. So one of the study, for example, showed that every mother was spending 11 more hours with their children during the week compared to what she was, whether it was shifting from the household work or shifting from the job. The disadvantage was that the labor market and the financial spaces where women was there, she was held back, and therefore the financial crunch, which Farida mentioned, was a lot more. In terms of gender-based violence, violence and abuse on mother and children, or men not being able to fulfill their role and having the stress and anxiety, has certainly created spaces to think about how do we work in a family engagement environment, because if we want to reduce the burden of stress and depression and violence on women and children, we will have to engage boys early on. We will have to use the school spaces to talk about gender roles, gender norms, and how in a family structure the workload is shared. We will have to talk about and work with the parents on the parenting skills. We'll have to work on men, that how men can work with the children in terms of the bonding, engaging, playing with their children. Men absolutely had no idea that how they can be supportive or how they can be useful. And not only they were feeling the stress or inability to fulfill their own role, which they have traditionally done, but also not being able to engage their time in a very productive manner was creating more anxiety. But of course, as we all heard, that if men were 30% anxious, women were 60%. So it was definitely, the burden was double. But I feel that moving forward, if we work on different age groups, and if we use school platforms, we used healthcare providers platforms. First time I started hearing in the healthcare institutions that what about mental well-being of the employees? from the corporate sectors, the people were contacting us that can you offer mental well-being or overall well-being of our employees. So I think mental health was always an issue, but it surfaced more. People started talking about more. The stigma went down, and healthcare institutions and hospitals and schools started learning about and offering and becoming more responsive towards the mental well-being of the families and of women and of men in general. And therefore, many programs now have come into institutions and could come more if we mainstream that how every institution at a workplace and in schools, universities can provide mental well-being and talk about sexual reproductive health and rights. Access to contraception was denied, and therefore unwanted pregnancies were there, abortions increased. How do we make sure that the commodities are reaching to the basic healthcare centers, and how the role shifting not only from the community midwife, but to the lady health worker. And also, as Farida mentioned, that men were deprived of all those healthcare providers, and therefore men health promoter role, people have started talking about that, how we engage men and boys being the health providers. So I see some of these strategies of utilizing family dynamics, of elderly talking to the children, women being more connected to the children, fathers being more connected to the children. They were all pushed to do that, and they felt the stress of that and the time crunch of that. But if we can use all this learning and all these needs and take up the domestic violence, but in general the violence in society, and take up the mental health area and set up programs which can help men and women generally, and focusing on men and boys more, will also reduce the burden of all the violence and depression on women. So I would say that while we think of the programs on women, we should think of the programs for teachers, for parents, for men and boys as well. So Anita, I'll stop here, and then later if there are questions, we can certainly take it up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rozina, for sharing your experiences and insights, and also giving us a way forward. Now we move on to Dr. Nargis Asad. Let us hear from Dr. Nargis on the impact of COVID, especially on the mental health of women. Over to you, Nargis.
Thank you. I think coming in the last is advantageous because much has been said and I don't have to repeat a lot of things. So see, the way COVID impacted masses and how it impacted men, women, and you see other genders is you see have been spoken very eloquently by Farida and by other colleagues here, and then you see more developmental and more different groups from their perspective. Dr. Rozina mentioned students working, non-women, all of working and non-working women. See, we've heard all of that very clearly. I'll just narrow down to maybe, you see, but if you want to take up the gendered understanding of COVID, then you see we can go left, right, center, everywhere. But I'll just narrow down to maybe, you see, our healthcare providers and to the women patients that we see in our clinics. So, see, from working women perspective, I think, you see, there were several experiences that I gathered, women talking to us, women sharing their experiences in terms of maintaining work from home. That was a challenge, of course, as Dr. Rozina said, that you see being at home and then not being at home. So it was like, you see, a present but absent kind of a status, which was very difficult to manage by or to, for this woman and for the rest of the family to understand that, she has to sit in the drawing room and do her work, where you see it was dual working family, and you see husband obviously was also working from home, and the woman also needed the drawing room to work. It was very difficult for the working couple to share spaces, because obviously you see workplaces will be different, the work will be different. So you see women had challenges there. And then you see, not all households have air conditioners, not all households have comfortable seating. So you see the comfort zone would go, you see, in most cases would go to the men, and women had to, go through a struggling time to sit somewhere else where probably the temperature wasn't comfortable or the place wasn't comfortable to sit. So that was the challenge that I gathered from in my practice and in my, you see, like in my social context, and it's a sharing of experiences that I heard of. Also, like you see, from the perspective of women patients who visit our clinics, the opportunity to visit hospital in person is in itself, and this is what you see, like we knew at the back of our minds, but I think it really came out very clearly that visiting hospital is also therapeutic. See, it's their private time, it is their time, they get ready, they come here. You see, like I've heard so many of my women patients saying that, see, you see, when I come here, then I sit on the bench outside and I just keep watching people, and I spend half hour extra here to just, you see, like see people coming, going, and you see, seeing students and seeing all of you, talking and smiling. And so it is kind of, you see, it's empowering for them to come, you see, to, talk to your psychiatrist, to your therapist, and I'm sure it is with other healthcare providers as well. And but for us more so, because there's more time, and it is you see, like kind of more connectedness that we have with our patients. And this was kind of, you see, I thought it was something very novel for, for our understanding. And when we transitioned from in-person to in-person spaces to the cyberspace, I think this was great learning. And you see, although our patients very smoothly transitioned in about, you see, a couple of weeks to, you see, taking their appointments online, and we were the specialty that, you see, we did not lose our patients. Somehow, as Dr. Rozina said, mental health was there, and some of our OBGYN faculty or friends, they laughed that, you see, we were busy and you guys were busy after infectious diseases people, because there were more babies, and you see, they were delivering more babies, and then obviously we were seeing patients. So we did not lose patients. And women who, for some of them, it was easier to maybe connect on online, and they did not want to lose this connectedness with the psychologist or with the psychiatrist. They went on online, and they never missed their appointments. But for some, obviously space was an issue. And you see, like as I said, not all have facilities, and not all have, big houses where they can have separate space. So there was, you see, a lot of confidentiality issues that, you see, if a woman is talking, then the husband is listening, and this became a great issue where husband did not know that the wife was coming, and it was difficult for her to maintain her consultations online, and that increased anxiety, that increased insecurity. And this is how, like you see, these are the experiences that we gathered, our first-hand experiences working with our patients. So space issues, confidentiality, and we know that, you see, the nature of the beast is isolation. You suffer in isolation when you have COVID, or when somebody in the family has COVID. So the family is cut, the person is, you see, in quarantine, which in itself has, you see, great very grave mental health sequel that one can talk of when one is isolated and in quarantine. So you see, if I take this perspective that, you see, women who lost this opportunity to come in person, that had a mental health impact for them. But you see, many still continued because it was still a ventilation, and they wanted to keep that kind of connectedness. Also, you see, there were threats and there were opportunities. Of course, there were several threats. You see, women losing jobs, women working from home, small industries, as you see, Farida rightly so pointed out, the the self-care industry, you see like small stitching businesses that women have, or they work from home for, you see, preparing certain stuff, all of that was lost. So there was this financial crunch, definitely, and it had a mental health impact, because then there were less resources, and then they had to make ends meet in such limited resources. So that was one, but then there was opportunity also. Women who found it difficult to make a telephone call, they learned how to transition to using WhatsApp calls and using Zoom, because we were only allowed, and you see what institution policies said, we could only do clinics on Zoom, and so women learned that. So there was opportunity as well in terms of learning, and it made them feel empowered. They could make payments, and then they could take up sessions. But it had, obviously the flip side was more deeper, in terms of finances, in terms of, handling work, in terms of, family not understanding their role for working women and for healthcare providers, where relationships were not congenial to start off with or at the baseline. I've gathered experiences, personal experiences from healthcare providers, women healthcare providers, who would say that, मेरी सास ये कहती है कि मेरे बेटे के करीब मत जाना, वो बीमार हो जाएगा, तुम अस्पताल से आई हो. So this was the struggle that our frontline workers were facing, and obviously it led to the problem with COVID was, the major thing is isolation. And when you hear such things, obviously it takes you to another level of being socially isolated, not being understood, and then obviously there's depression, there's anxiety, there's this sense of insecurity. So this was kind of, that social disconnectedness and non-acceptance of people, or non-understanding of the family members, was something that, many of our healthcare providers, nurses, doctors, they suffered, and other people who worked in the health sector. So these are, and then obviously then, as I said, all of this, quarantine, working with less resources, losing opportunity to, move out to more, public spaces, go on their own, travel on their own, all that was compromised. And obviously that affected mental health quite a lot. I've had, jinke paas wasail hote hain, har kisi ke paas, I keep saying that everyone does not have equal opportunities, but where people do have little opportunities, we do work on those lines to help them feel more empowered and be able to explore life for themselves. So I've had, women living nearby, malls in Karachi, and for some it was, like it used to be, pre-COVID times, it used to be, a sense of ventilation and kind of, some level of एक वो तफरी का जरिया था कि one would say that I'll just go to the mall, I will not have money to buy much, but then maybe I'll just go have tea, and then sit somewhere and see people moving, and see people how they shop, and how they see families move for. So just like getting out of the house, moving to a public space, just spending some time out, used to give them a break from their, mundane stuff that goes on at home, the responsibility burden, the parenting burden, looking after their kids and families and extended families, all of that. And obviously we know that, when men and children were home, obviously the demands and their, the family's demands increased, and women's workload increased. So, and that had an impact on their physical as well as mental health, less sleep, less rest, and then like just being on their toes all the time. So, another point that, like I feel is important to touch upon here was Dr. Rozina did, talked about it briefly, but COVID and pregnancy, that has had a huge impact. Women, you see, were afraid what will happen to their child. And then later, as we evolved from, you see, that extremely, extreme sense of insecurity and uncertainty that what is going to happen and what will, this virus take us from, you see, from February or January 2020 to be evolved to, you see, and we progressed to vaccinations. But when it came down to vaccinations, it was like, like pregnant women were very afraid because there was no data. But then slowly, when the data flowed in and you see they were encouraged to take vaccines, they were still very insecure and anxious. And sometimes their husbands would not allow them to take vaccination. So that was the time. So from the virus to, you see, to now where we are at this point, you see, we know that, you see, what protections need to be taken and how vaccinations are of help. All of that, you see, has had you see, a differential impact on women. And so, but then, you see, like, I'm a firm believer in opportunities also. I think this, the beast of COVID has also opened up some, you see, great opportunities. So we have our, you see, tele mental health services up and about. We are very fluent with that. And then you see, like, people are able to access us not only from within the city, but all over Pakistan, international as well. So we see people from all over, and there are several women that we see who are not able to, if for some reason, not able to make it to the clinic. You see, taking a Zoom appointment for them is easier. So much so that, as I said, walking to the clinic was in itself an empowering experience for women to come in person. You see, get ready, look nice, come sit, talk to your psychiatrist, psychologist, or meet your doctor anywhere in the hospital. And those opportunities were lost at that time. So this is what I have to say. I think much has been said before me, so I need not to repeat all of that. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Nargis, for sharing your valuable experiences. It is so encouraging to see a very active conversation going on in the chat. And I'm so happy to see that colleagues have already made connections for future work and research. I don't see many questions around. There is just one question that has been addressed to Farida, that how can we expand women's social capital? So Farida, can you please respond to this question? How do we expand to women's social capital?
I think all of the work that everyone is doing is part of building that social capital. The basic thing, as Dr. Rozina and Dr. Nargis have said, is the isolation that women find themselves in because they don't have that connection. But I have personally taken the position that this is something which local governments should be doing, because local governments have the ability to bring people together. They should be providing the spaces in which women can collect in their neighborhoods. You don't need to get women to go to other places. What is proximate and possible? One, we should all include this and have opportunities for discussing. So what we learned so much is that women have no one to share their issues with. So engaging with each other, talking about issues is something that's important. And a lot of the issues that they come up with, for them to act, I think, could be responded to by our local governments. The unfortunate thing, of course, is nobody wants to have the local government elections right now. We have 4 provinces, all of who are refusing to go ahead with the local government. So, but I think technically that is a responsibility of the local governments. And of course, then there's the whole gamut of destigmatizing women who work. This is one of the things, destigmatizing women's mobility. Which is another major obstacle to social capital. If you don't meet anyone, your capital circle stays very limited to family. And if family is supportive, it's great, but if it's not, then it's not. So your neighbors, but how to get them in a more functional way, I think maybe this is something that we should all consider, but especially local governments.
Thank you so much, Farida. We have one question which is directed to Sabina. So Sabina, what is the value of continuity of relationship with the communities who are providing us with the information, which is also shared in the public domain?
Thank you for asking this question. I mean, like, continuity, I think it's because we're on the field at all times, and then school is a microcosm of society. It's something where one little human or 2 or 3 little humans of a family are coming every day. And then if we make it like a continuous relationship with the parents and make it mandatory, part of the school system, part of the entire ecosystem of the school, then there is no problem in continuing having that relationship and getting the feedback on a daily basis. It's not about like calling them for once in 6 months and having a seminar with them. It's not like that. It's daily. They come in daily. The school, I feel personally that schools, especially big schools, government schools that are made on big campuses, we can have one big hub school. We can call it a hub school in one district. And that school should act like a community center rather than a school. Why do those big buildings shut down at 1 o'clock and they lying dead till the other morning? They can be utilized all day for collecting parents. It's like a club for them. So this has already happened. I would like to invite all of you to come and see that oasis in Lyari. These are people in Lyari. Many of them have never gone to schools, but the way they speak about Zehni Sehat is mind-blowing. Even I sometimes, I'm just looking at them. कहाँ से ये लफ्ज तुम्हें मिला, you know? आपने फरीदा जी, आपने एहसास की बात की. हमने कुछ अर्सा पहले एक रिसर्च कंडक्ट की थी और मैंने कौसर से इसके बारे में पूरा जिक्र भी किया था कि हमने, मेरे ख्याल में कोई 300-350 लेडीज थी उसमें, छोटे छोटे ग्रुप्स बना लिए थे, 5-5 के, 6-6 के, और उनसे कहा था कि आपस में आप बात करें कि जितना भी ये डोमेस्टिक वायलेंस, चाइल्ड अब्यूज, कोई भी ऐसी चीज जिसको हम जुल्म की कैटेगरी में ले सकते हैं, उसके होने की वजह क्या है. वजह लिखें, आप पहले आपस में बात करें, फिर कंसेंसस निकालें, बिकॉज कंसेंसस लेना हमने इनको बहुत सिखाया है ड्यूरिंग द मदर्स सेशन. दे नो व्हाट कंसेंसस टेकिंग मीन्स. तो उन्होंने आपस में डिस्कशन की, गिव देम हाफ एन आवर टू टॉक एंड वी गिव देम अ पेपर, अ स्लिप, वेयर दे हैड टू कम अप विथ one word that is the reason of जुल्म को नॉर्म क्यों बना दिया. जुल्म कैसे नॉर्म हो गया है, वो अभी हमें जुल्म लगता ही नहीं. वो पर्चियां सारी हमारे पास आई अराउंड, मेरे ख्याल में छोटे छोटे जो ग्रुप्स थे मिला के कोई 30-35 वो स्लिप्स थी. वो हमने फिर बोर्ड पे कॉलम्स बना के उनको लिखना शुरू किया. एंड द वर्ड दैट केम आउट मैक्सिमम वाज एहसास. एहसास खत्म हो गया है, एहसास नहीं. अच्छा, ये आ गया कंक्लूजन, एहसास खत्म हो गया है. अब नाउ आई स्टार्टेड वर्किंग ऑन डेवलपिंग अ मॉड्यूल कि एहसास को वापस लाएं कैसे, क्या करें, एहसास को लाएं कैसे. एंड आई रियलाइज कि एहसास को वापस लाने के लिए हमें एक्सटर्नल चीजों पे काम नहीं करना है, हमें अपने इंटरनल पे काम करना है. वी आर सो कनेक्टेड टू द एक्सटर्नल. एवरीथिंग दैट वी डू इन आवर लाइव्स, या द अपलॉड, बच्चे को ग्रेड अच्छा आया, सबने अपलॉड किया, मेडल बनाया, स्पोर्ट्स में फर्स्ट आया, अपलॉड, ताली बजाएं, competitions, pageants, all this is all external. We have forgotten to hear the applaud inside us that happens for us, that when we applaud for ourselves. So the whole program that I conducted after that was called Reconnect, and reconnect to yourself. So inside out approach. And it was so invasive. It was so difficult, that program, because they had to go inside and take out their demons. It was so difficult that it went on for a good 10 days, 9 to 5. So it was a lot. It was very demanding. The moms used to take break to call their children up. My employees were involved in it. Sare employees pe humne mandatory kar diya tha ki until you don't go through this inside out approach, you will not be able to understand what the parent is going through, what the child is going through. So they went and processed their own traumas, their own aces. And I was surprised that there was not even one person who could say, I have no aces in my life. Not even one, including myself. So when you go into that place where you can actually feel your own pain and you bring it out and you accept it, that this has happened, that is where you step into the zone of empathy. And then it's easier for us to recognize the other person. तो और एहसास वहां से आएगा. एहसास क्या है? एम्पैथी है ना. जूते में जाके किसी के सोचना कि उसको क्या हो रहा है बड़ा मुश्किल काम है. तो हमने तो बाकायदा वहां उस एक्टिविटी में जूते उतारे और एक दूसरे के जूते पहने, लिटरली इसको परफॉर्म किया ऑन स्टेज कि आप जूता उतारो, आप उधर जाओ, आप जूता उतारो, आप उधर जाओ. It was a wonderful activity, and it really does. I'm so, like, right now I'm a little impatient. I would love you all to come and meet a big group of my parents. I will not sit in that talk. You people should conduct your research on them because you're the researchers, mashallah. I'm so happy I'm here today to meet all of you, this whole group of such intelligent women. I feel so proud of this gender today. Thank you so much.
Sabina, I just want to say that you are a researcher. Let's be clear. Okay, we call things by names. Obviously, you're doing research. If you're looking at what are the complexities inside us, you're doing much more than just research. You're actually doing transformative research. And I think that is where we need to go if we want to transform the societies we live in. So thank you for that.
So thank you. There is just this last comment, I guess, and a question attached to it. I think it's after your comments, Farida. So this participant is saying that the state is patriarchal. So will the local government do something about this issue? And how do we expect this platform to enable women to build social capital? Would the government, being patriarchal, really look at it?
So the state is patriarchal, our society is patriarchal as well. So the only thing you have on this is movements for change. And we will have to push the state as well, I mean, including the local government, just as we have pushed them on every issue where we want change to happen. So far, unless we're talking about a revolution, which is one way to go, but we're not talking about overthrowing the state, etc. We do depend on the state. What we need is far more women in the local government system, which is something we've been fighting for a long time, and engaging and getting people to actually engage with their elected representatives. So it's not going to be easy. Mere to baal safed ho gaye lad lad ke, but I presume if we all get together and we push for them, it's not an automatic thing, but they do have the means. You have the public schools, yes, but local councils have rooms for people to sit. Why are they not encouraging women to come and sit and talk to each other? Why are there no conversations just amongst the citizens? The previous local government act actually enforced having meetings and including women in these meetings. The new acts do not have this. So I think this is something we should be looking at in terms of what needs to change. So everything is patriarchal. But I do find that the younger people in Pakistan, the young boys, the older men are usually too entrenched in their patriarchal privileges to want to change. The younger people are also oppressed by that same patriarch, and therefore they're more willing to change. And I've always been very surprised and delighted to find young men who don't like the system any more than women do. And at the end of the day, patriarchy is about a system that needs to change. It's not just individuals, because the boys are also oppressed. It's a hierarchical system. So we just have to do our best. Sab milke karenge to kuch hoga, varna kuch nahi hoga.
We now need to close the session. Our sincere gratitude to all the participants for their active and engaged participation. A resonating note of thanks to Ms. Farida Shaheed and the panelists, Dr. Rozina Karmaliani, Ms. Sabina Khatri, and Dr. Nargis Asad for today's enlightening session and for such productive talk. Participants are required to please complete the feedback form, the link of which is being posted in the chat box. Thank you everybody for being with us. And let me also thank all the departments who helped us organize this session and the working group of women for giving us this opportunity. Thank you very much, everybody, and Allah Hafiz.
Thank you, Anita, for bringing us all together.
Yes, and for running the session, and also to the working group for women, which I've come back to after a long time. So I'm delighted it's still going, and anytime you want me, I'm there for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rozina, Nargis. So nice having you all.
Thank
you
you,
everyone. बहुत मजा आया.
Thank you. Allah Hafiz.
Great.
Thank you.